Makes sense.
Good.
All right. Good morning and welcome to the Conflict Consortium virtual workshop. We're presenting a paper by Jule Krüger, Information is Not Knowledge, Overlap Analysis and Certainty in the Empirical Study of Conflict and Violence, a comparison of the reporting of civilian casualties in Sierra Leone. And Devorah, if you would get us started, please.
Yes, hi. So first of all, thank you, Will, for the opportunity to participate, and good morning to everyone. So I was asked to give 5 minutes of comments to get the discussion started. So I thought I'd start off with some of the main points that came up for me, and then once we open it up, I can add things as the discussion develops, and then I'll send you written comments when this is done. So this was a very interesting paper to read. I thought it did a really good job laying out the issues at stake in a very, very clear, well-organized and compelling way. The argument that you make that convenience data has systematic measurement error is, like I said, it comes across very clearly. It's very important, obviously. And as you note, everyone seems to acknowledge this point theoretically, but then go ahead and use the data anyway, which raises questions about their findings. And your analysis provides strong empirical evidence for what others have suspected, which hopefully will make the critiques more difficult for researchers to ignore. At the same time, that brings me to the first point I want to raise, which is that some of the evidence that you bring or the data generating processes that you show are things that, on some level at least, are already known to researchers and are even explicit features of the data set. So we already know, or at least suspect, as you note, that news data tends to be biased towards urban areas or more intense violence. We know that peripheral regions are less accessible. And I don't think that researchers working with this data would necessarily dispute those suspicions or say, as you sort of implied, that they're random or that they can be assumed away. At least I hope not. I'm hoping that's a straw man, but maybe I'm wrong. What they would do, I think, is either to argue that this is sort of better than nothing, which I think you addressed, or to show that they are taking account of the bias in some way. For instance, by controlling for some of the more obvious biases like distance from the capital, et cetera, in their models. So given those kinds of responses, it seems like the two camps that you talk about are sort of speaking past each other. And I think what could move the conversation forward, and you seem to be really well positioned to do, would be to address more concretely how substantive research in this area can advance, or at least address more explicitly how some of the methods that people are using ostensibly to address bias are inadequate. So you touch on this briefly in your conclusion. You have, I think, one sentence where you mention MSE. And my question is that really the only available solution? Are there others? So for instance, can these data perhaps answer certain questions, but not others? Can they speak to causal relationships within the sample, even if they can't be generalized perhaps to the entire population? And might that be useful or valuable for some kinds of questions? So, maybe it's worthwhile to investigate high-profile or intense events or areas on their own and then speculate on their applicability elsewhere. Are there ways of modeling some of these biases and incorporating them into the analysis? When is that possible? When isn't it? And I guess that would just mean expanding your discussion and conclusion to make it, again, just more applicable or more useful for substantive researchers in the field. And then a second suggestion in that vein that I had was to expand a little bit your discussion on generalizability of the Sierra Leone case. So you note that this is useful because there are 5 different data sources, which really helps obviously establish your point. But it might be problematic in other ways. So I can imagine, for instance, that this is the case where access is particularly difficult. So would you expect there to be more overlap in other conflict settings? Does that mean these problems would be mitigated in other contexts? To what extent would they or wouldn't they? I think that would be useful for others as well. And also, would you expect the characteristics of the data sources that you identified or the data generating processes that you identified, at least in the 2 main data sources, to hold for other contexts as well? So in other words, is there any sort of more generalizable argument that you're making here about ACLED or UCBP, or is this specific to the Sierra Leone context? It seemed like it was specific to the context. That seemed to be what you were arguing, but I wasn't completely sure. And if these specific data sets are not, or you know, if it is an argument about these data sets in Sierra Leone, maybe the source type is more generalizable. So maybe you can say something more general about types of bias associated with media sources versus testimony versus NGO data. And you do that in your hypotheses, but sort of incorporate that into a discussion of generalizability. And I think that would enhance what you bring to the broader debate. I had two more sort of minor issues that I thought I'd bring up now. First, more of a question. So you talk about this really interesting HHS survey, which seems to really undercount and underrepresent violence for several reasons that you note. But you also seem to suggest, I think this is top of page 32. You exclude it when you're talking about the data sets, and you exclude it from your discussion in some ways because it's a random sample. Even though, of course, it's a sample of the population, right? It's not a sample of the population of casualties. But since you touch on these surveys and sophisticated random sampling methods and surveys, I wondered what the fact that you found that this survey is undercounting so much, what that means for these kinds of surveys. Are they worth the investment given the realities of violent conflict? And again, maybe they're useful for other purposes, but as far as trying to give us a count of events, it doesn't seem to be a very useful tool based on this case. And then the last thing I'll say is, this is again kind of minor, but you call your time distance effects variable recall bias, which I thought might not actually capture what you're measuring here. It seems like the time distance effects is better and more general because, as you know, I think under coverage of less recent events might be the result of other things such as availability of witnesses, maybe if people have been displaced or whatever. And you're also very explicit in the beginning about the fact that you're analyzing representativeness of data and not accuracy of data, right? You say those are two separate critiques and two separate issues. I think calling this recall bias might conflate those two a little bit. And that, by the way, is an interesting distinction in itself between the accuracy and representativeness. Maybe that will come up later. And just to let you know that full enumeration of deaths is also available in the Israeli-Palestinian case, which might not cross the threshold, but it is. So that's it for the beginning, and I look forward to the discussion.
Jule?
Thank you so much, Devorah. You raised some really interesting questions, and I feel that I always get asked these questions, and I always feel that I'm pushed in certain ways to answer questions that I feel that cannot be answered. So this is really what I'm struggling with, because what I'm trying to show in this paper, and maybe it's just a point of where I need to clarify more, is that these data generating processes vary so much over space and time, basically from moment to moment and place to place, that I'm still struggling with on the one hand, always I feel the demand to provide more information about generalizability, and on the other hand, I feel that this issue has to be explored with every specific case at hand. And so I really like your question of whether there can be further research. So I mean, what I think is, what I feel is that we know that these biases exist, but we cannot measure them, because even I cannot measure these biases. I can only look at differences in reporting relative to what every one of my 5 sources is reporting. So we cannot really control for them because we cannot measure them. Even I cannot measure them. So how would we control them for them in research? I just feel that these issues are always ignored, and we just go forth with our data analysis nonetheless, and it's just kind of discarded. So this is where I'm trying to place my paper. In general, I really like your comments, so I'm going to think about them, because I feel that I need to be more explicit in what I'm trying to show and what I'm trying to raise.
Chris, you're the chair.
I couldn't tell if she was reflecting or not. Give me a break.
Oh, I'm done. I guess I'm done. I have to
Thank you for the cue. Okay, so I thought you were reflecting for a second. So I saw Devorah kind of like nodding, and I couldn't tell if you wanted to have a clarifying moment before we continued, because.
Maybe just real quick, as far as controlling for the biases, or as far as, controlling for incorporating that in your model, maybe because it seems like that's what people are sort of, the defense that they're using, right? People are saying, well, so I'm putting an urban, or distance from the capital variable in my model. Maybe it makes sense just explicitly addressing how those techniques that people use are also problematic. And I guess the sort of more broader takeaway would be to bring yourself more into conversation with the substantive researchers. That would be sort of my main point.
So my main response to that is that we are using this variable, but we're using it to explain violence. Right. And this is the whole point of this paper, that we are using all these variables. I'm using the same variables that we use in this research on violence to explain violence. But what I'm saying is that these variables, I use them to measure reporting patterns.
To explain reporting.
And so it's not clear what these variables are actually measuring. And my argument is they're measuring reporting patterns, whereas the existing research is arguing that these actually measure violence patterns.
Right.
Which I'm trying to show is not the case.
Okay, so I will, Regina, you will take your. Okay, thank you for the mute. Ralph, you're unmuted, but unacknowledged. So deal with that one. Okay, so Will.
Actually, Matt, you missed. Matt had a one finger. He's first.
Okay, Matt, you're up.
Okay, I wanted to say also that I really, really like your paper. I really like what you're doing. I just encounter a tremendous number of articles that I get to review and so on, where people just say, "Oh, well, our data is not very good, and there's nothing we can do about it, so moving on." So I just want to make that point to start out, that I think what you're doing is super important. So I wanted to bounce off something that Devorah said by focusing on the household survey. So I think we have like really strong theoretical reasons for thinking that household surveys are just better than these other approaches if you want to get a sense of what's really going on with casualties in a conflict. And so one thing I wonder is, why not just compare the other data sources to the household survey source and then suggest, well, the household survey source is really the best, and these other ones, and see the extent to which the other ones correspond to it. But that gets me to another point, which is that a household survey is not really a registration system. Right? So the other systems, if I understand correctly, are actually trying to register total numbers of deaths, whereas household surveys aren't really doing that, right? So they're not trying to like throw the net as widely as possible to pull in as many casualties as possible, but they're random sampling across the entire population, which you would expect would not register as many total deaths. So I guess what this leads me to wonder about is, in comparing these different sources of data, that maybe by doing this sort of logistic regression or correlations on counts, that's not really that might not be the right approach. That what you might instead try to go after would be differences in rank orderings across different units, right? So you'd want to know, say, across chiefdom months, whether the different data sources are giving you the same rank ordering of where casualties were high and where they were lower, and so on. And one thing I think that potentially is important about this is that I think for a lot of the kinds of applications in which people want to use these data, if the rankings are right, then it's not going to affect the results that much, as long as So if the numerical counts are off, but the rankings are right, then it's not really going to affect the regression results all that much. And so there's a whole set of statistical methods for looking at rank order correlations. So I guess like the most basic one is this thing called the Spearman's rho, that might be worth looking at. And so, redoing your data as rank orders, and then looking at rank order correlations is a way to see, well, how similar are those? And then maybe the problem is not as serious as what you've identified, although maybe it's just as bad. And I think this has one additional big advantage, which is that you wouldn't have to throw out as much data as you do by sort of doing the record linkages, right? Because what you'd be doing is rank ordering based on counts, in which case the actual identities of the victims wouldn't be consequential, right? So you would be able to keep in a lot of the data that you throw out in the process of establishing the matches. And then you could do rank orderings at different levels of aggregation. So like chiefdom year, chiefdom month, and sort of look at, well, you'd be able to tell the literature, hey, you can use the ACLED if you do chiefdom. But if you do chiefdom year or chiefdom month, things are going to go awry. And then I guess the last point is then you could try to use that as a way of looking at specific findings in the literature and saying, okay, well, which ones of these do we have problems with now? Because now we know that the rank orderings are not sort of matching up. So that was kind of long. Sorry about that, but I'm going to mute now.
Thank you, Matt. This is the question about the survey is really great, because as I was finishing this draft of the paper, I was thinking if I could actually make more of a case of comparing all the other data sources to the HHS, because I can weigh the death counts, and then I would have a pretty good representation. I just wanted to add that the HHS survey was conducted to document violence. So it was conducted as a further measure next to the CGG data and the TRC data, because that provides a third system from which we could estimate multiple systems estimation. And I really like your suggestion of looking at the rank orders. So I'll just say that I'm going to explore that as well. The main reason why I'm losing so many records in the record linkage is because some of the data aren't as specific on the chiefdom and the month. So yeah, but thank you so much.
Well,
okay, I'm going to make a couple of different points over the course here, but I want to start by suggesting that one thing that I think is quite easy that would be useful to researchers who are actually focusing on a single case, have multiple data sets, and we're wondering how to go forward. I think if you could, in effect, provide a recipe summarizing in the conclusion the steps that you recommend they would take, because I think you've done a really great job. I like a lot of the graphics that you've produced, and I think adding the rank orders, I'll echo that. That sounds like a good suggestion. I also want to suggest that there are people who are modeling the DGP. You write on page 32 in the conclusion, put differently, observed patterns need to be interpreted as patterns of data generation, not patterns of violence. And in Conrad and I, in our ill treatment and torture project, they're making that exact same point. And I'm going to go ahead and give you all a link to a working paper where we go ahead and actually do model the DGP. And if anybody's watching this and wants that, it's look at the Social Science Research Network under me or Courtney Conrad, and you'll find the paper. It's about decisions to hide torture. Those become they're mixture models, right? And so there is a tool available, and I think that would go some way to helping address the point that Devorah raised, that says, well, what are applied researchers supposed to do with this, right? Because this comes across as a methods paper, and I think it should, but I think a lot of researchers who you want to be reaching are going to read your paper and say, well, that's all well and fine, but there's nothing I can do about it, and that's not true. But I think you can do a better job relatively easily of pointing out what can be done about it, not only for the those who are working in a single case, but even those who are working with multiple cases.
Jule, you're good? Okay, Gina, then Ralph, did you have something up? Okay.
Okay, so I also really like the paper and the spirit of the enterprise, and I think the data analysis is really creative and original and important. That's it. The framing is a bit funny at the beginning, and so echoing kind of some of the themes that Devorah was raising, I wondered, and what Will just said, I wondered straight off the bat whether your main contribution was really just identifying and describing this problem, or if your main contribution is showing us in like a fine-grained empirical way how to diagnose the nature of the problem in each of our projects with the data, and therefore to hint at solutions or ways to be more explicit about sort of the biases or the differences in data generating processes and conflict data. And you say a few things, you sort of undersell yourself in the first few pages. So you say a few things like, my main contribution, my main argument is telling conflict scholars that when you have convenient samples, you're not really getting a report of violence. You're getting, you know, this data that was produced in a certain way. And you know, that struck me as a fairly obvious point. I mean, I think that most people recognize that, and it is a bit, you're setting up a bit of a straw man, as Devorah said, in that, you know, if you tell conflict scholars you need to think more critically about how your data is generated. I mean, I'm sure you can find some examples of work that doesn't do this at all, but I think a lot of people do sort of recognize this and try to grapple with it successfully or not. So I think that a more original, like a more substantive contribution of the paper would be to highlight more the tools that you're giving people to deal with this problem. And it might not be fixable, but maybe the solution is better diagnosis, or being more explicit about the limitations that you know, these data generating processes put on our research. So I thought that one, you know, like there's different solutions you might propose. One solution is change your data, right? Like get better data, gather better data. That might be difficult. Another solution is change the population of reference, right? So maybe we only are able to generalize about events, like large-scale events that happened in an urban setting in a particular conflict. And that's still probably valuable. But I feel like your tools that you're giving people in the article set us up to be able to say, wow, I have a really good data set that's doing a good job of capturing these types of events, but not these other types of events. And then that can be used to sort of speak to generalizability. Like maybe some data sets are really good at capturing urban events across different conflicts. So that's just like one suggestion, but I think to me, if I got it as a reviewer, I would want to see more on the solution side, or even if the solution is just diagnosis, like presenting that as your contribution, not just identifying this one point that people have thought about before. I have a couple short suggestions just of other things to consider. So I wanted to see more engagement with multiple systems estimation, and I found it kind of strange. I mean, there's even on page 2 or 3, there's some statement that, well, you know, to make inferences about violence, we either need to have a full census or we need to have a random sample of the population. And like depending what inferences we're trying to draw, and if we have a closed system, I mean, you could, with the right types of data and names associated with the data and things, you could use multiple systems estimation, obviously. And I mean, you're citing Patrick Ball repeatedly, but the body of the paper doesn't really address multiple systems estimation at all. So, and it doesn't get at geographic variation subnationally in the way that you want to, but I think you at least need to say this is another approach that people use in some settings. In analyzing your data and looking at the patterns, I thought that doing more spatial analysis could be a really interesting way of comparing the patterns that we see in the different data sets. So when you have the different maps showing us the intensity of violence across the different subnational units, and we're visually just seeing the different patterns from the different data sets, I mean, you could do something like hotspot analysis, or you could do something else looking at spatial autocorrelation or spatial patterns across within each of the different data sets, and then we would know, for example, oh, are there statistically significant patterns? Is this one data set actually identifying the center of the violence being in the center of the country, and another data set is identifying it being in the periphery, because it's hard, sometimes just eyeballing things, it's hard to look at different maps and know if there's really statistically significant differences in spatial variation or not. So that's sort of leapt out at me as a really interesting addition to the project, and it looks like you already have the data in the right formats and programs to do that. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Jule, you good?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm good. These are really great suggestions, so I'll consider them.
I was next up then, Ralph. Two things. One, I think in line with some of the other comments, I think the stakes involved could be more clearly stated sometimes. It's like, I suppose, following Gina's comment, it's kind of like, I'm like, which questions can we not answer? Or which questions do we have more leverage on? I think you could be a little bit more straightforward with that, and it gets us to the kind of stakes of the thing. You end up settling on kind of like armed conflict, but you could frame some of the scope. For example, I'm like, is it all lethal violence, human rights violations, repression? Is this involved at all? Labeling that, I think, would be more clearly identified. I'm kind of riffing off of something that Matt suggested. Sometimes I think you're talking about the best source. Sometimes I think you're talking about different sources. And sometimes I think you're talking about the best use of source material. And these lead in several different directions. So in my book, I was actually trying to move away from bias, which is kind of privileging that there is a truth out there and we're using sources to get to it, and arguing that it's actually important to explain and explore differences as different people are using source material for different reasons for mobilization. That has nothing to do with the truth. It has something to do with, that has something to do with how someone is using the information. And that would be, and so I think, and that links to information arguments in the conflict literature, because if our understanding or common understanding of the conflict is important, then understanding differences in information that's generated would have direct implications, and that is a potentially different enterprise than trying to get at some uniform truth that all these sources should be leading towards, which I think is implicit within your particular argument, that these things should be leading toward a truth, and thus latent variable modeling and such would be kind of something that you would kind of also like to move towards. But the thing I was pushing on in the book was really try to kind of get at this issue of, we shouldn't try to get rid of the differences. We need to acknowledge the differences, which many people do acknowledge that there's differences between the sources, but they don't take it the next step, which is to try to link it to theoretically exactly how does this influence what it is that we're engaged in doing. Will had a quick two, which is kind of, I suppose, riffing on the riff, and then we'll go to you.
Yeah, that was actually the other point I wanted to get in, and that is I want to see you add a scope condition to your paper, because you implicitly are assuming we're interested in ground truth. I think most people in the literature are also implicitly thinking that they're interested in ground truth, but I think that's a real problem in the literature. I know in my own work, there's very little work that I've done where I've actually am interested in the ground truth, and that's because I work in a theoretical framework in which I'm modeling. I'm always wanting to model the behavior of actors in response to the information that's available in the environment. And if that's an argument you're going to make, then news accounts are actually a very good indicator of that information. What actually truly happened is not available to any actor in a political system, particularly when we're talking about the kinds of events we're talking about, where there's so much, for all the reasons that you point out, so much that's hidden, etc. And so, so Chris and I are very simpatico on this point, and I want to encourage you in your work to point out that sometimes we're interested in ground truth, and when we are, all of this follows. Other times we're not, and several of the projects I've pursued, I wouldn't want a Truth Commission report contributing to, because that's going to add a whole bunch of noise that was not available to actors that were acting at the time.
Yeah, thank you both. I agree that I need to be clearer with the scope conditions, because basically what I didn't say, but what I mean is I'm talking about lethal violations. So because non-lethal violations are a whole other issue in terms of record linkage, because then we also have difficulty with determining whether, when we have a report of 2 events, we don't know if these happen twice or just are reported for different time intervals, for example. I have to check if I'm really talking about a best source in my paper, because this is not what I intend, because sometimes I hear that people say, oh, we just have to get better at collecting data, but what I would argue is that there is no best data source out there unless it is a census, because we just never know how a data source relates to the true population of killings, and if, as Will also points out, if the interest is in ground truth, then whenever we are not randomly sampling from that truth or getting it in a full enumeration, then we just cannot make that reference. And it's true, I will have to add also the explicit statement that I'm speaking to all that work that is talking to that is trying to explain the ground truth. And I mean, we're also making an assumption in some way, because I've heard that argument too. Yeah, I'm interested in what actually happened at the time and what actors knew. But then, for example, the UCDP data, they have there are a lot of data sources that are exposed. So it's information that is still collected after everything that happened. So then such data would not be a good choice of data to look at that. And also, we're kind of making the assumption that, for example, in the actor data, we use a lot of, there's a lot of major news agencies like Reuters, and that makes the assumption that rebels somewhere in a chiefdom are actually reading all the major news every day to figure out what's going on in the world. And that is also kind of a very strong assumption. So yeah, but these are very great points, and I'll have to see how I make that much clearer in my paper, what I'm actually addressing, what issue.
My quick two before.
And it also links to what Gina said. I think it was Gina, right? You said that I have to be clear about that maybe we have to change the population of reference. So this is also like one point where it's the question of what we are talking about. This kind of relates back to if we are working by what we assume actors could have known. So these are great suggestions.
My quick two before we move into Ralph. If lethal violations is the thing that you're doing, then it would be useful to say, such as armed conflict, civil war, human rights violations, genocide, and revolution. And that is to build your audience, not to limit it, because right now this reads as an armed conflict, civil war piece, and I think there's implications for all conflict that is kind of like lethal in nature. Gina.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, sorry, I just have a fast two-finger, which is I wanted to maybe disagree or push on this a little bit, that I think that your basics kind of scope conditions or the range of issues that you're speaking to actually go way beyond lethal violence. I mean, so the same, I meant to say this earlier, that the same data generating process and reporting biases and problems that you're describing are present in a lot of other types of data sets. So like I've seen some really bad papers on protests. I mean, I once saw a paper that claimed that there were no protests in Guatemala, like ever, which is totally not true, but the truth is there are no protests that get reported in English language media in Guatemala, and then there are like lots of protests in Argentina that get reported in English language media, for example. So I mean, you could expand this to like basically anything that relies on media reporting. You know, I know someone in our department, Melissa Nobles, is making this data set of lynchings in the American South, and she's actually comparing court records and other things with media reports from the time and finds totally different patterns. I think about even surveys, like the type of data we're getting back depend on the questions that we're asking and the question framing. So I think that you could go much broader. I mean, certainly link up with these other areas that Christian mentioned, but you might want to gesture that this is a common issue across like sort of all of comparative politics and political science.
Matt, were you a 2 or a 1?
I was a 2.
Hit it.
Okay. Maybe this is excessively nitpicky, but there was something in the paper you said about ground truth being a census, and you repeated it again. And like, I don't think ground truth is a census. I mean, censuses have like all sorts of problems, you know, just like any other data reporting system has. So I think what you have in mind is something like an idealized census that isn't like a census that actually is conducted in the world. So I would just not, I would take that out of the paper.
You mean like God census, Matt? Are you talking about like
Yeah,
God
yeah,
census?
something like that. God census, right? An actual census is going to miss all sorts of stuff, especially if you're talking about violent events.
Ralph.
Good. Can you hear me? Good. Sorry I'm late. I'll get started at once. First of all, this is a highly enjoyable paper. I took it home, enjoyed it with a beer. I think that says a lot. I'll start with 2 points. I have several ones. First one concerns the overall framing. I'd like to second what Will and Gina said here on the framing. As it stands now, it comes off a bit on the negative side, pointing out everything that people do wrong. And it even starts out a bit hostile with the title and the first quote. And I'd really like it if you could, as I think Will suggested, maybe Gina too, make some positive suggestions towards the end and what kind of strategies will work to improve data, to improve our analysis, and not only focus on this sort of negative aspect of everything we do wrong, because that might be a bit provocative to some people. My second point is many of my points are UCDP points, since, well, the GED is one of my little babies. And I'd like to start with some of the treatment of GED versus the other 4 data sets. And I think there's an issue here that the other 4 data sets, so in a way, they try to relate to this concept we've been talking about, the ground truths. And a difference with the GED is that what we try to capture is actually theory-based. Whilst sort of a census and the ACLED tries to capture all data out there, all civilian victims, as you would call it, that is not what the GED is actually about. It's about organized violence, or it's about armed conflict. It's not about just specifically violence, and there will be a difference. I'm not sure what kind of effect this would have on how our data set relates to all the others. But I know, for instance, in comparisons, ACLED and the GED, it does have an effect. So ACLED, for instance, would show you that Nigeria and South Africa are the most violent countries in Africa over the past few years. And of course, that is true if you're interested in violence specifically. The GED is not interested in violence specifically, but organized violence. There's a theoretical definition underlying that. And I mean, if this paper ends up on the table of any of us crazy UCDP people, these will be issues that will come up. So I'd like to see your reactions to that kind of statement, that theory is relevant for the GED, it does not seem to be for the other projects. Those are the 2 points for now. I have a lot more later on, but start with that.
Jule.
Thank you, Ralph. I'm really excited to have you in this discussion because it's. I must say that I think the UCDP is a really great data source. Especially what I really liked was that you actually say what the sources are, where events were found. I agree with you that I come off as a little bit hostile, and I'm happy to work on that to make it sound more positive. When it comes to the comparison of the UCDP data to other sources, what I understand is that people are using it to look at patterns of violence. So it may not be the point that the way the data was produced, you know, we have that a lot. Like, data is produced and then it's used in a different way than it's intended. And I think I read in the codebook that it can be used to obtain a representative idea of what's happening on the ground. So like in spatial and temporal patterns. So that is why I actually had a lot of, this paper was much longer in the beginning, and I had a lot of references to the codebooks, both in ACLED and UCDP, where these statements are made, and said that that's why I'm using these data for this type of comparison, because there is information on violence, and one of my arguments is also that even the way that UCDP or ACLED data are put together, that's also part of the data generating process. So by you setting up code books and making the rules of which cases are going to be included and which ones are going to be excluded, these are all decisions that generate the data that we finally download from a website, and people use these data then as a representation of what happened on the ground. They do not take into account this entire process that came before to generate the data. So maybe I have to go back and add some of my citations back in my references to the code books, and maybe also cite some of the works that use the UCDP data in the way that I'm saying is not so good.
Zeynep.
Hi, Jule. Thank you for. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
You're slightly low, so you might turn up your volume a little bit, or scream. By the way.
Can you hear me now? Is that better? Hello? Okay, good.
Much.
Okay. So one of the questions that kept on occurring to me is, why is it that you choose Sierra Leone? And you say it's because there are these 5 sources that you can work with. But what's missing is a benchmark, right? An understanding of the true distribution on the ground. And then you say that there are at least 2 cases, Bosnia and Kosovo, in which we have this type of distribution. So why not choose a case in which there is a benchmark and you can compare different sources and then compare them against this benchmark, as opposed to Sierra Leone? That would be the first question. And not to answer my own question, but one thing to say might be, even in the case of Bosnia, the data we have actually is a result of asking questions to relatives of people who are missing about what happened during the war. So it's not really, there's still potentially bias there. So one thing you could do might be just remove that footnote, that's footnote 1, and just, don't say that there are cases in which we know the true distribution. That would be one way. And then the second thing to do would be, the reason we might not care about not knowing the distribution is that sometimes theories have predictions that are that would apply to both, say, for example, urban or rural environments, or both to capital cities or the periphery, right? If the theory would apply to either one of these cases, we don't care about the bias so much. And so to make this point, it would be really nice to sort of take some cases of good practices from the literature. Say, here's a theory, and here's a data set that had some bias, but actually is appropriate to test this particular theory. And if you could use these types of examples from books and published articles, it would really, I think, strengthen your case. And that's it.
My quick 2 with that, actually, I really like that idea of kind of identifying. It gets back to the scope conditions issue, and I think that's really great. One good thing about perhaps studying this particular case, or you could identify that if it moved through space, like if the fighting moved through space, then clearly you need to deal with both rural and urban environments, right? And so it would be useful to kind of like play those kind of issues out, so someone could get back to, as I was suggesting earlier, the stakes. But this clearly kind of identifies it. Did you want to respond to Zeynep, or can we continue?
Thank you, Zeynep. Your question of why I use Sierra Leone, as far as I understand, the UCPGD data, they are only on Africa. And the ACLID data, there are some data on Kosovo from ACLID, but they actually don't have casualty counts, not the data that I saw back then. So when I was looking for a data source where I was looking for a case where I could really get a high count of sources and also include ACLID and UCDP, because those are the main sources that are being used in the type of research that I address. So I was really trying to maximize my leverage for comparison. So and it's true that it would be nice to have a benchmark. I'm actually working on another paper where I'm looking at that, but that's in the case of Kosovo. But there's no data sources that the Polisario community is using. So, but that will still be a case. But the point is also, when I do that, there's always I have the fear that when I measure bias for one specific case, that this will then be taken, okay, so data sources of this type are biased in that way. And my whole argument is that this is an interaction between the conflict environment and the environment in which a source is collecting data, so that these biases are also bound to vary over time and over space. So that there is not, every type of source is not biased in a certain way or another. It's really always in the specific context of where the source is operating.
I have a 2 that, I have a 2 that'll fade into a 1. The 2 is this kind of call for greater contextualization of Sierra Leone. So I was kind of like, relative to other conflicts of a similar ilk, is this longer, shorter, more severe, number of actors, all this business? Because the minute you're doing one case, regardless of how detailed it is, the large N group is going to be like, this doesn't really apply to me. So you need to find some way to kind of like reel them back in somehow and kind of show of what you have an instance, or kind of what tail have you grabbed, and let me lead you back to the cases that you're normally used to kind of looking at, and then think about a little bit more the different ways that different problems might be kind of like magnified and or bring people in. Gina?
Okay, just really fast. I mean, another justification for Sierra Leone is that it's a case where there is a lot of work by political scientists and a lot of subnational work. So you could, if you had sort of a little small section motivating Sierra Leone a bit more, I think that's a valid point. It would be really interesting to think about how some like well-known conclusions that we have from influential substantive articles about Sierra Leone would be different if these factors you're raising were taken into account more.
Thank you.
I'm definitely liking that. Do you want to respond to that, or?
I have a question for you, Christian. What do you mean? Like, what would that look like in practice? I'm not still clear what you meant with.
You could imagine some basic descriptives of different kind of like conflicts that are like similar to Sierra Leone, right? So, of all the armed conflicts, what is it? You have like 4 years of data? Like, I'm sorry, is that a lot? I mean, so literally give me some sense of what the other conflicts that this is similar to look like, to get some idea if Sierra Leone is shorter than most of the conflicts in the database. There's fewer actors. I mean, I just like lost some sense of comparison to get some general sense of how that would look relative to the other cases that you could draw upon. So we have 30-year conflicts, we have 10-year where we expect the problems to be more or less similar or worse in that context. If there are fewer actors, I don't know how many actors there are in Sierra Leone, right? So it's like, are there 2? Are there 7? Are there 15? I mean, so what are these modal characteristics for others? Matt had something.
Yeah, I'm sort of just following up on some of these points about framing and sort of how your results are going to be used. I mean, one way to think about this is that, people are going to wonder, like, is this a methods paper or is it a substance paper, right? And like, I think the problem with it being a methods paper, which is kind of the way it looks right now, is that for the most part, people expect a solution in a methods paper, right? They want to see, okay, well, there are these problems, and here's how you fix them, right? Here's a way to get past those problems. But if it's a substance paper, then I think you got to go after something, right? You got to like identify some influential findings and say, well, if they'd use this other data set, or if they'd use my, aggregated data set, they would have gotten really different results. So I think like you might want to think about that sort of methods paper, kind of substance paper distinction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can I say something on that?
Sure.
What I really struggle with, I mean, this paper is already long, and I already cut it in half, so the original draft was like twice that length. And I really like the idea that I include some example of how the results would be different were we using another source. I just don't know where to fit this, because I feel that it's just exploding my paper and it's getting too long for a journal article. So I'm really struggling with all that I could put in there, and all that's not yet in there, and all that's already in there is already so much. So maybe you have some suggestions for me of how I could address that.
As usual, I'll do the I think you have 2 papers here argument, but but clearly in the paper that I send to you, you'll see exactly how I'm suggesting it. So it imparts a function of if you want to lead with your very cool figure that I've always liked, or if you want to lead with your table. Because I think that leads in the direction of different papers. Because if you're setting up that table and you're trying to get me to understand what these different variables mean and how they're important and so forth, then I think a lot of the stuff that you talk about is not coming into play. Because then you're just trying to set up that argument. So for example, for a second there, I thought you were going to orient the discussion around the organizational literature. You kind of hinted at that. But from that kind of general orientation of the organization literature, I expect you to talk about the resources available, the mandate, the personnel, the location of the agencies, the network, and the political orientation, as I do in my book. You kind of step away from those in many respects and address a bunch of other topics. So I could imagine a version of this paper which is, okay, we need to understand the source, the sources a little bit better, and we can understand these sources looking at the organizational literature and following these characteristics, and then that leads to then a little bit of discussion of exactly how organizations collect information. Then you need to kind of clarify the distinction between isomorphism and niche development, because those move in different directions, but they're in the same literature, and then effectively lead us to mandate and break down by personnel, location, resources, orientation, and so forth, the different sources, and then that leads us to the table. That's a very different type of paper. That's a little bit neater than you're trying to do, and that would tend to kind of shrink it down. You've taken on a great deal, and thus I think you end up, that's why the paper is so large, because you're addressing a bunch of different topics concurrently. Ralph has it too.
Yeah, just on if you wanted to put some more substance, and I think there's things can be done to make the paper you have now shorter, and in the end then add in something else. For instance, there is some repetition in the introduction and the section number 2 and 3. Some arguments are repeated, and I think you can make the introduction shorter with the same sort of twang you have, and then just use some of those arguments, develop them in what comes in section number 2. And there's also parts of section number 3 can also be compressed, I would think, without losing any of the arguments you want to make. And in terms of, if you want to show sort of any effects of how these different data sets function, I mean, if you can show sort of a substantial difference effect, the 5.3, the differences in pairwise comparison, I mean, that's an interesting section that I certainly enjoyed. But in a way, sort of the results there are exactly what I would have expected from the analysis that have come before. So that section could maybe be made into something a bit more substantial if you want to talk about it in that way. I think that might help to sort of show the actual effects of these data generating processes instead. Because again, yeah, I think I would have what's in 5.3 is what I would have predicted just based on the sections that came before. That would be my suggestions. But I think it would help. I mean, I like it the way it is, but I think it would help with some more of that kind of substance people were mentioning. That was it.
Deborah on it too.
Yeah, I'm going to agree. I think as far as shortening this paper, from my perspective, I think there's some shortening and editing you can do on the front end of the paper, which is very, very long, especially on those points that are sort of easy to make. So I really think, you know, it's very, very clear early on that convenience data is problematic. So I don't think that needs to be, you know, expanded on that much. And again, I really do think people agree on that, at least theoretically. And then maybe another way to, and so shortening the front end and then definitely expanding so the conclusion is very, very short. And that to me was sort of the most interesting, you know, as a substantive researcher, if you go on the more substantive route, so discussion and conclusion and your implications would be longer. I also wonder whether if, and I think this speaks to the previous point on the repetition and the hypotheses and the findings, maybe if rather than sort of discuss each hypothesis at length, you formalized it a little bit more. Because again, these are pretty straightforward. Yes, we think that distance from the capital will make it less likely to be captured. But so you can even sort of formalize these expectations in a much more sharp and brief way. And then in your results, you either confirm or not confirm. In your case, you confirm those hypotheses. So I think some of that discussion could also be edited out. And then the description of each source, I think, can also be edited and made a little bit shorter. That takes up a lot of space as well. And yeah, that's it.
Gina. Gina, unmute. Free yourself.
Sorry, I forgot. I got so excited, I forgot. I was going to say that I have one word, which is appendix. And I don't think you really have an appendix right now, as far as what we were sent. But a lot of these things, like some of these more basic sorts of points, you could just say really briefly in the paper, and then, bam, refer to appendix. If you know, or refer to footnote, and some of the like slightly more descriptive information about the different data sets or things like that. You know, you could move some of this stuff, or you could verbally summarize just in words, you know, in a few sentences, some of these main findings that, like, yes, the patterns are, the differences between the data sets are basically what we would expect. And then, bam, you can put some of the other material potentially in an appendix if you need to, and then free up a bit more space for yourself. And I agree with the suggestions also about condensing the beginning of the paper, and also just thinking about ways to, you could keep the structure potentially even at the beginning of the paper, but shorten the word count of some of the existing sentences and ideas, and then insert in you know, some of these other more substantive or more important contributions, like, into the existing structure.
My quick tip before going to Will was I think some of the hypotheses are so straightforward, and I mean, now go back to the 60s in terms of kind of identifying that we think urban-rural distinctions matter, or other types of things, political context, a bunch of things would be kind of straightforward. So much so that I wondered about the interactions. I'm just like, clearly location and size, right? So it's like, so rural location, but a lot of people. I mean, so, and because I felt like we'd gone through so much that the analysis kind of moved kind of quick, and then we got to the conclusion, and I was kind of like, well, hold it. A lot of the independent variables, I don't know that I would have necessarily highlighted them, but some interactions made as much sense, would make much more sense to me, and that I think would actually be more representative of moving forward some of that discussion, and even the detailed discussion of, like, I think there's like there's a coup or some of your temporal variables. I was like, pool them. I mean, like, do I really need to hear the story of each one of them? And maybe you want to keep them. That's fine. You try pooling them and then try to separate them out as well. But yes, there's a 2.
Actually, Gina hit my 2, so appendix.
Deborah.
Yeah, just as far as interactions, I had the same response, and I was wondering also, for instance, about time and intensity, because you talk about if it is recall bias, then it would be interesting if those interact in any kind of way.
There's been a bunch. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, you have there's an appendix, right? Like, my paper has an appendix.
I saw an appendix.
Yeah, yeah. So because I actually pushed a lot of it there because that was first in the paper. And which other interactions would you be interested in? So I heard time and intensity, which I agree they're interesting. So what else would be interesting to you?
Location and size. I think I had 5 different ones in I'll send you the paper marked up, but there was like 5 ones that I thought kind of like naturally followed. But location and size was clearly one. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Ralph.
Yeah, I just like to push the expanded appendix issue for a different reason as well. If I would like to replicate what you've done with the UCDP GD, I would not be able to do that as it stands right now, because there's some things that just confuse me and haven't been stated clearly enough. What parts of the data you've taken out and how I could do it in the same way. And it confused me, for instance, on page 13 when you talk about those 7,335 bodies in Freetown. And I mean, I recall coding that specific event, so I know that all those 7,335 are in UCDP data. They've just been, some of them are in the best category, some of them are in the high category, and some of them are coded as unknown because we didn't know who was a civilian and who was not. So I mean, I would need more information on how you created these variables in the appendix, definitely, but I would need that if I wanted to try to replicate anything. So that's another argument in favor of an expanded appendix. That was it.
Yeah.
Just to be a little bit more clear, what I was trying to say was that I guess I thought of the figures at the end as like just kind of additional figures for the paper, and but it's right that there is some appendix information there. But what I really meant to say was to make a totally separate document that would be your web appendix, or something that you're going to put online that's not going to count against your word count. So you could you could think of having like a priority 1 appendix where there's some things that need to go with the paper and would actually get published at the end of the paper. But then you would probably end up with a fairly massive online appendix where you can explore some of these issues people are raising and reference, people who want to replicate this or who want to do this for other conflicts. You can send them to the online appendix.
My quick 2 is, or acknowledge that it's just a book, but that's a separate point. So, one thing that I liked about this will sound strange, but I'm already in mid-sentence. One thing I liked about my book was figure 6 or 7, which basically tried to argue that all our information comes from either individuals who were part of the conflict or were bystanders/observers, and then effectively everything moves from there. And so either human rights organizations are going back to these people, someone narcs on somebody else, someone survived, someone told their parent, whatever. But that starts it all. And the organizations basically are trying to get back and capture that. And so if you go the ground truth route, then I think you need to basically revisit this in some way, shape, or form, because that captures the whole thing. And at present, it's kind of obscured. That's why I think the organizational approach, I like it in many respects, but these are organizations that are trying to basically crack this nut of information by getting back to these individuals and participants. And other organizations can block, right? So the government can block, and that's why I had political orientation included in my stuff, because if the government was involved and they were not trying to give you access to information, then this could interfere with your ability to get stuff. If the government changed, okay, then that switches the situation. And so while organizations matter, that's why this, I think the household stuff becomes interesting as well, because, okay, yes, we've hit the household level, which is now individual, but it's an organization that's collecting the damn survey. So it's there's a bunch of different ways to kind of navigate the individual organizational dynamics, but I think explicitly figuring out which one you think is kind of driving it, but dealing with this basic conceptual issue, I think, would be useful. Response before we move to Zeynep.
Thank you. It's taken. I'll look into it.
Zeynep.
So I'm going to suggest an addition to the paper, and I apologize for that, but everyone suggested, and I agree with that it would be nice to have a section that talks about your recommendations, right? And one way to do that, I was thinking, would be to take maybe studies that use the same source, but using one is better than the other. And the way to do that would be to say there is bias, or maybe the collection procedure has an impact on the findings, but in one case it affects the theory testing, but in another it doesn't, right? So it depends on the argument of the paper. So I'm wondering if you can think of examples of books or papers in which you think using the ACLED or some other source works well, and examples in which it doesn't work well, and whether you can incorporate that into the section where you would discuss your recommendations.
My quick two on that one is this, Gillian Schweller and I were once trying to write this paper called Pollyannish Political Science, and that was because we argued that happy stories were always more likely to be resonant and picked up, and then that's the one that would carry the day. So negative papers never work, regardless of how accurate they are. So it's a bizarre way of kind of getting there, but many people suggesting that you tell us that we don't all suck would be kind of something very useful to basically kind of communicate to the potential audience to get people to like read it and cite it properly. And at present the queue is open, so anybody run with what you have. Jule, go ahead.
Yeah, before I was citing some papers, but I just feel that I'm finger pointing, so I took that out. So it's because I found it too negative if I cite certain papers and say, so this is in my eyes wrong, and you would have gotten other results had you used another source. So this is exactly why I took that out, for example. And
I think that approach is actually a little bit better, right? Because at least you're selecting some sacrificial lambs as opposed to telling all of us that we suck.
Yeah, then one could see it that way also. Yeah, that's true.
Matt, and then Gina.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to second Zeynep's point about that. And I mean, it's one of the things I was trying to get at in my original comment about looking at rank correlations, is that, well, you know, differences of counts, they might matter, or they might not. And, you know, like I was suggesting originally, if the ranks are the same, then it arguably doesn't matter that much. So I think this idea of trying to, you know, identify some existing work that gets things right and explains kind of why it gets it right, you know, because it's done at a particular level of aggregation, whether temporal or spatial, uses a particular data set, or focuses on particular theoretical problems that can be answered using the data. Whereas, like, say, somebody else just, let's say, disaggregates as much as possible, which seems to be the current vogue, and then ends up with problematic results because of that. I mean, I think you can make a real contribution there of sort of trying to explain to people, well, it sort of depends on things like kinds of theories you're trying to test, what you're trying to test them on, what kind of level of aggregation you're using. I think that might be quite helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So I want to say I really agree with all the comments, and I don't think, for me at least, I'm not necessarily asking it to be more positive in the sense of like cheerleading existing work, but rather to be more like constructive. So instead of just, I mean, one could walk away from your paper as it's written right now and think like, let's just throw up our hands and not work on this stuff, right? So even just hinting at either ways to diagnose limitations and work within those limitations, or ways to actually solve the problem would be great. So I wanted to raise two ideas that haven't come up or that aren't in the paper right now. And I mean, one, sort of Will and Christian have gotten out of it, but it's the idea of interviewer effects. So you could link up with the entire literature on survey research, and which is huge, right? And we know, I mean, this is part of the data generating process in all these efforts, well, in the ones that are based on some kind of interview and recording the responses. It's not just question phrasing, it's who gets sent out to do the interviews, what do people report to interviewers of different ethnicities or national origins or even genders, and you could even, I mean, you could make this paper speak to a much broader audience than it's speaking to right now. You could cite like some of the research even in American politics on these things and show that even when we're not talking about highly sensitive material, the answers we get back depend quite a bit on who's doing the asking sometimes. So that's just one suggestion and you can do this in like 5 or 6 words and then some citations, right? But you can bring in different literatures and broaden the appeal of the paper a bit. So another interesting idea that I thought you might just want to consider discussing is like some of the stuff that Chris Blattman does about estimating directions of bias and trying to figure out sort of how bad the data would have to be to change a substantive result. Not necessarily the exact magnitude of the result, but the entire nature of the result. So like if we think, for example, in Sierra Leone, if we think there's some conclusion, substantive conclusion about something causing something else in patterns of violence or whichever piece of work you want to go after, you could potentially think about your issues you're raising here as contributing to the process of trying to estimate the direction and magnitude of bias and sort of like work through how much it matters that these data sources are different from each other, kind of echoing a lot of the other comments that people have made. So it's just another potential direction.
Jule, keep rolling.
I want to respond to this. Is it still not clear in my paper because I moved away from bias because I cannot measure bias because I don't know the ground truth. I don't know how these sources are actually selecting cases from the truth, and my results would completely change if I had different data sources. So because these are all concepts that are relative to each other, because I'm looking at what one data source is reporting relative to what the other 4 data sources may have reported. So that's why I also really liked the suggestion to change it from recall bias to time distance, because my results would completely change if I included another data source, for example, because then we would have a different snapshot of what happened. So this is really important to me because I can't speak about bias actually.
Gina, jump back.
So I just wanted to clarify a little bit. So this stuff, like if you look at Chris Blattman's, it's his 2009 APSR article, and he just kind of tends to do this in his projects in general, so I'm sure it's in other projects that he's done as well. The type of bias that I'm talking about is not bias in reporting relative to ground truth. Exactly. What I'm saying is that sometimes like we have our coefficients, or some estimate of some effect, substantive, like in a substantive argument, and then we want to know how. Basically, like how many deaths or how bad would the rank ordering have to be? It depends on what the substantive argument is you're making, right? But sort of how bad would our independent or dependent variable of interest have to be for this to change the direction of the coefficients, in the analysis that we've just gotten, basically. And then you can work through, I think, with the types of analysis you are doing, you could work through, like, is it plausible that ACLED is missing half the violence in the country? Is it plausible that ACLED is missing 90% of the violence? Is it possible that it's missing 98% of the violence? And so if you, like, the type of thing that Blattman does is his finding might be, wow, for this change, this substantive finding, we would have to believe or be able to make a case that ACLED was missing, 98% of the violence in the country. That's sort of an extreme illustration, right? But that's what I meant. I wasn't exactly talking about bias relative to the actual ground truth of the events that happened.
Jule?
Yeah, I have a question. Would you find it contributing to the paper and helping it if I included an MSE estimate of how much violence I actually estimate to have been there in those 5 years, and refer to that as a benchmark of how much every source I estimate has underreported? Because I can estimate from the 3 HRDAC sources. Yeah. Okay. Then
Straw poll. Everyone, thumbs up, thumbs down.
Okay, then I'll do that. Thank you.
Ralph, you're up.
Yeah, thank you, Gina. Those were some great points.
Wait, you skipped me, Chris.
Ralph?
So there's a tension that I feel, Jule, that you don't seem to see, and you keep saying my results would change, but the fact is you don't. If I understand what you mean by that, you're saying any results that any model that someone used would produce different results depending on whether or not which of these sources they used. And I think a lot of the pushback you're getting is, well, we don't actually know that. What models? You don't actually have a model, right? In the sense of you have a single variable that you're counting, right? We don't know if it's a dependent variable or an independent variable. So implicitly what that means is you're interested in ground truth. You're interested in the measurement of this one variable. So I think addressing that would be useful, and that goes toward, I know you don't want to pick on someone individually and so forth. So I've come up with something that may be absolutely crazy, but it allows you to not pick on anyone. What if you said you used the different data sources to measure whether there were enough deaths in each chiefdom in a given unit of time to consider it to be a UCVP conflict or a civil war, and then actually showed how that would change, right? Across all the chiefdoms, and you don't have to blame anyone or whatever. I think that's probably crazy, but it occurred to me, and what the heck, I'll throw it out there.
Since I'm not saying Jule. Okay, Jule.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I'll look into this, how hard that would be to see if I came up with a different, for example, UCP or ACLED picture, if I were using the other data and the other sources. You said there is this tension on how I speak my results would change. I'm talking really from a methodological point of view, that I'm saying I have this pool of 5 data sources, and if I had 5 different data sources, or let's say kept one and had 4 others, the relative differences between these data sources would change, given that there is a different data generating process for every one of them. Yeah. Okay.
Ralph?
Yeah, great. I wanted to ask some stuff that doesn't link up with adding more in, but that relates to what's in the paper right now. Turning to the variables you use in your analyses. And first of all, your measurement of event intensity, which I have somewhat of a problem seeing how it relates, how your measurement of it relates to your theoretical version, because it seems to be that it's like a 30-day, it's a month count of number of deaths in each chiefdom, which basically means that we could have 1 killing each day, which would be a minor event, so say of low intensity, which would then accumulate to 30 over those days. So we could have 3 killings per day, which would then give you 90 deaths, which would be a very different thing from one event which has 90 deaths. That would be an intense event, which then is actually related to the event intensity. The other cumulative scores, I kind of question how valid this measurement is for what it is you're looking for theoretically. And secondly, I don't know what anybody else feels in regards to these dummy variables, but you seem to use quite a few of these dummy variable controls that basically divide Sierra Leone into different time periods. And I would probably want to see some discussion of how valid these are, because just chopping Sierra Leone's civil war into different periods, I mean, they might be packed full of measurement error. There might be a lot of other stuff going on that these variables are actually catching up, what they're actually catching. So if there's some way to show that they're valid, that they're actually measuring these periods of time instead of any other activity that goes on in these specific amounts of time, that would be nice too. And as a final point, I loved your visualizations of these simulated predicted probabilities. I was wondering if it would be possible to add some substantial effects in terms of numbers as well. I mean, these geodesic distances, for instance. What kind of differences are we seeing here when we use ACLED as compared to the UCDP, for instance? Just to predict probabilities in tables, very good, but I'd also like to see in numbers, so I can sort of visualize it also in terms of numbers. Yes, that's it. Thanks.
Jule, did you have something, or are you ready?
I can respond, and thank you, Ralph. So the measure for event intensity, the idea behind was that because this is kind of my unit of analysis, the chiefdom month, so the reasoning was if a lot is going on in a chiefdom in a specific month, that raises the general intensity of that month because a lot is happening. So even if it were a killing a day, then that's kind of more intense than another chiefdom month where there is not a killing a day. So that kind of could be drawing attention towards that specific time-space window. That was the idea. The dummy variables, you're right, I agree with you. Can you suggest a way to measure whether these indicators are actually valid? Because even in lots of the analysis we're seeing in the literature, we're using a lot of dummy variables, and how do we know that they're actually measuring what we're measuring, that they're valid? So do you have a suggestion how I could do that? I like the point about the substantive effect, so I'll look into that to visualize that.
Ralph, go ahead.
My answer is no, really. I'm just generally against those kind of large-scale dummy variables for which validity is completely unknown. They just throw me off a bit. And I don't know, maybe one way that I would I'm not sure, I haven't thought this through, be a little more convinced is that you use these, you have the Ike scores and the big scores in your models. You don't seem to actually use them. But if at least you could prove some sort of improvement in model fit when these are placed in the data, that might make me believe that they're actually relevant for the whole bias process. Maybe, I haven't thought that through completely. But otherwise, this was just sort of mainly a methodological issue I kind of always have with these sort of large-scale dummy variables. So I'm sorry, I'm useless. Yeah. Can't help you there.
No, but thank you. That's a great idea. I'll look into that. Thank you.
I have two things. One is something you've said a couple of times. I was going to suggest why don't you call the paper Generating Data or Understanding Data Generating Processes, but then you keep saying if you had different sources that you can't really tell anything because it's highly variable. But I'm just like, how can it be so highly variable if you actually believe in the organizational approach when the things that should matter for the variability are the personnel, the resource allocations, the location of the source, network, and orientation, which that kind of brings some control to it, right? So I don't think it's as highly variable as you're suggesting. The second thing was regarding temporality. It's kind of like I like that you have different types of temporality as a function of source, right? So some sources are dealing with recall bias problems, and others are dealing with media fatigue effects. And you don't really address or model the media fatigue effects, but it made me think of that particular dynamic. So the media fatigue effect could be modeled by like Schroet and Gerner were doing some stuff back in the day, but after you have a highly intensive moment and there's some attention to it, then there's like a decay function thereafter. And so there's different ways of kind of getting at that would be. Then you have different conceptions of space as a function of source. The urban-rural one we've talked about a great deal. But you could also have like a zone of conflict one, right? So if you were a military zone for most of the conflict, then in all likelihood, challenging events are more likely to be remembered at that point, or something like that. And so I think that if you're going to kind of identify space and time, then embed it within your discussion of the different source materials a little bit more richly, I think, which would be more directly in line with kind of where things are, but I think more in line with kind of actually what you're talking about. And Q is open.
Can I respond to you?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah, thank you. So my saying of, I'm not saying that the data generating processes are changing. I assume them to be, but what I'm saying is my test of them, my empirical test of them would change, because it's basically what I compare the capture of one source to. If that is not the ground truth, what we were talking about, then if I'm comparing it to what other sources are capturing, then that is a relative concept. So in the methodological, basically in the methodological realm where I'm doing the empirical test, if I'm not comparing it to what actually happened, which we don't know, then my results change. Because if I, for example, assume that one source is drawing mostly from urban areas, but I compare it to another source that's also mostly drawing from urban areas, then I'm going to get a different empirical result comparing it, if I was comparing it to a source that is drawing completely from rural areas only. Because in the second case, I would confirm my expectation, but in the first case, I would say, well, there was only stuff going on in the urban areas. So does that make sense? So it's about the empirical.
It does, but you're making me think of kind of Przorsky and Tooney, right? We should be trying to replace the proper name of the source itself with these characteristics that you think are more important. And if we controlled for them, we wouldn't have these problems. But
yeah. The point is that what I was struggling with, and which I think have to be clear in my interpretation also, is that basically what I'm doing is I'm saying, so there are these data generating processes, and I expect them to have that change, but I can only test it by comparing it to what I know about other data generating processes that I'm comparing this to. And so I can make an expectation that given the two data generating processes, I know I'm expecting one source to capture more of this and the other have more of that. So like that there will be differences across the records that both of these sources capture. That's why I find this, it's a little complex. So, and I think I have to be clearer in describing this in the paper.
Most deaf. We are open queue.
Regina has a 1.
Regina, missed you. Yes, move your finger closer to the middle of your head, and then I would be all good. My bad.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks. So I just had one concluding comment that obviously draws on what everyone has said, which is that I think there are two different kinds of inference in the world. There's your descriptive inference and causal inference, and to me, I think that distinction underlines a little bit of the back and forth that we've had. And this paper could go in either direction, right? It could be framed as, essentially what you're engaged in here is a project of descriptive inference. But you could frame the whole paper as being about descriptive inference. And I think that then to be a really strong, really top standalone paper, not a book, but standalone paper in a journal, then I think if you go 100% in the descriptive inference direction, I think you have to give us a solution, or some kinds of best practices, or some kinds of generalization in the way that Christian is describing. For example, like actually categorizing, creating some typology of types of data sources and types of data generating processes, and then categorizing, like putting these data sets you're using in dialogue with other data sets. I could imagine even some kind of chart or some kind of multidimensional space with the different axes where you classify all these different prominent data sets people use, and then we would at least, if the real contribution is like a solution, and B, a portable solution to a descriptive inference problem, I think you have to give people tools to use sort of the basic insights you've created here in other settings. On the other hand, if you want to be speaking to people who do causal inference, like maybe your basic, or who think they do causal inference, maybe your basic point is that if you get the descriptive inference wrong, then it's going to bias our causal estimates. It's going to bias, or correlations that we're interested in, or whatever we want to call them, like substantive findings. And so that's just a totally different direction for the paper. In many ways, I think that would be more true to being in dialogue, or it would be that would mean you'd be sort of engaging with some of the substantive work you criticize like more on its own terms. You know, it's kind of funny to say, I have this critique of this person who's making a causal argument. Here I'm going to have an entire paper about descriptive inference. And so I think if you go in this, like, let's improve descriptive inference to improve causal inference, or at least to be more critical about causal inference, if you go in that direction, then I think you have to engage in a more concrete way with existing substantive work. And I mean, if you don't want to pick on anyone in particular, one idea could be, like, give us a census, give us a literature review and a table, just really compact, of every single major political science article about violence in Sierra Leone. Just pick, you know, like 6 or 7 journals where we might expect this kind of article to appear, you know, anything about subnational variation in Sierra Leone, and then go through all of them briefly. And in a table format, you could even just say, like, if I use these different data, like, you could have one column could be article, the next column could be if I use data source 1, if I use data source 2, if I use data source 3, and so on, and then if I use my merged data source, and you could, in each of the cells, you could just tell us, do the substantive findings change in a big way? I mean, like the direction, so the sign of the coefficients, the significance of, you know, coefficients or whatever method they're using. And, you know, that way you're not picking on anyone, but you're in a generalized way saying, like, look, these descriptive inference issues do matter for causal inference. Or maybe they matter for some types of causal inference, but not for others. And, you know, so I think that would be really helpful. But I think it's a totally, you could be even more aggressive than that. I mean, I think it's a totally standard practice to critique existing published work, especially in this kind of paper. And you don't have to do it in a nasty way. I mean, you can throw people some bones. You can say, you know, these articles are using absolutely standard practices. They're using the best available data. They have really, you know, like, they try to address these issues. But still, if we use these other methods for the initial descriptive inference, then their substantive findings do change. You know, and I don't think that would be viewed as overly aggressive. All right.
Jule, you have the final word, I believe.
Wait, Chris, Matt had it too. Can we
Matt, shoot.
Get Matt and then close with Jule?
Got it.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to jump on what Gina said and say that I mean, I don't think this should be thought of as picking on anybody, right? This is what we do. But we also shouldn't prejudge the matter, right? So you might have a look at some existing papers and find that they did things pretty well, or their results are robust, and that's really important and something that we need to know.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, remember that there's a high note that has just been hit, and now you're up.
Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate your comments and your suggestions. I think I'll watch the whole workshop again just to get all the amazing suggestions that you made, to take good care of it. I really appreciate the time you took to read my paper as well as to give me comments. And yeah, I hope that we'll get to meet at some future conference to chat more about this and also your work. So I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Will and Christian, also for putting this this opportunity out there.
Excellent. Everyone, thank you very much for joining CCVM, and see you at the next episode. Be well.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Will.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jule.
Appreciate it, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye.